Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine war mapping update, but just a small area I'm going to look at. I don't do enough of these, which is looking at one particular area of the map and just doing a short video on that. We're going to look at the area near the Zaporizhia reservoir, just southeast of Zaporizhia city itself, Stepnohirsk area, that the Ukrainians have been counter-attacking in because they, one presumes, want to keep the Russians as far away from Zaporizhia city as possible. And they appear to be doing quite a good job there. And the Russians are somewhat panicking. There are a few Russian statements that have come out today that I think are worthy of note. So we are going to look at them. Look, before we get there, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. Keep yourselves in the loop as to what is going on in the war in Ukraine and beyond. Okay, let's go to the details. We're going to start by looking at Andrew Perpetua's map here. This is Ukraine, right? Remember, there's a lot of operational security, so there's no mapping change really at all in this whole area. But things have changed. And you can see that there are some yellow arrows in this area. A lot of people concentrating on this area, the Holypole sector. We are hearing tonight that Pokrovsk and Myrnograd have been fully now taken by the Russians. That is a claim that's coming out tonight from some Ukrainians as well. So it could be that this whole area now is broadly under Russian control. But we're not going to be focusing on there. We're going to be coming down to look at the area next to this reservoir, which is no longer full of water. Google Maps still, or whatever mapping basis this is using, I think it's some form of Google Maps, it just renders it weirdly, like when you get closer or when you get further away, I think it is, it then goes into, oh, not on this map, on my map, the further away you go, the more it shows actually that it's not got as much water in and it's mainly land. But on this map, it treats it all as water. But bear in mind that this is actually not all water, although we are talking about an area where a river is coming into the reservoir, and a couple of areas actually down in Plavny, but also up here in Primorska. Okay, it's worth noting that Andrew Perpetua has never had the Russians in control of all of this area, but other mappers very much have. Here is ANK mapping going back. This is going back to February the 14th, so a couple of days ago, and this is already showing gains for the Ukrainians, right? So imagine the Russian line is further to the north of here, but you've got this river sort of coming in here, causeway sort of going up there, and the Russians at this point, just to let you know where that is on Andrew's map, the Russians are, as according to that map, up here, Primorsky. So effectively, this is what pro-Russian mappers have. I'm not saying MK is definitely a pro-Russian mapper. I'm a little bit confused about where they sit really, but they certainly listen to the Russian MOD a little more than, say, Andrew Perpetua. So, essentially the claim is that, the Russians have been, broadly speaking, all the way up here. I don't think that's true. And part of the problem with trying to work out what's going on at the moment with regard to these Ukrainian counterattacks, counteroffensive or whatever, is the idea that if you think the Russians are all the way up here, and then the Ukrainians are then attacking down here, then you think the Ukrainians have suddenly taken tens of kilometers of land back. But the reality is the Russians probably weren't up there, and you may have had deep reconnaissance groups up there, but the Ukrainians are down here, right, where they are fighting, but they haven't actually taken all that land off the Russians. And it probably looks more like Andrew Perpetua's map. So if we go back in time, this is on the 15th, down at the bottom here, you'll see there's really no change, other than a little bit of a change to the gray zone. So the gray zone here is in yellow. This is where Russians are active, but Ukrainians are also potentially active as well. It is a contested area. Back on the 10th, he had the Ukrainians taking back an area here fully under their control. So the Ukrainians clearly very present in that area. And that's pretty much where it stayed ever since. Although, the Russians then possibly having some joy in the gray zone in that area. But the idea is that if the Ukrainians are fighting all the way down here in Stepova, down in Plavny again, near Malishabaki, then if you are a pro-Russian map or someone like AMK mapping here, then that's going to show huge Ukrainian gains. Okay, anyway, we are going to look at Rebar to begin with, a very much pro-Russian mapper, with some comments. I don't know if this is actually from Rebar. This is probably from another Russian mill blogger. The Ukrainian Armed Forces offensive near Stepnohirsk. Stepnohirsk is this town here. That's Stepnohirsk. Just a bridge being destroyed there. You can see that's where we're talking about. The situation on the western flank of the Zaporizhia front has deteriorated sharply over the past 24 hours. The enemy is attempting to cut off the penetration towards Zaporizhia along the shore of the former Kakhovka reservoir. Ukrainian forces have launched an offensive along the sector approximately 20 kilometers wide. So if we talk about 20 kilometers, that's going to be going from here. So there's 20 kilometers. So broadly, this whole area, Mali Shabaki to all the way to the side of the reservoir. So anyway, there you go. That is, too many rulers there. Right, going back to what this mill blogger says, what is known at the moment, recent reports of release, increased enemy air activity, which is targeting lines of communication, poses an additional challenge. The crossings over the Yancharak and Karachak rivers remain bottlenecks for the transport of reinforcements, despite the depletion of the Kakhovka reservoir. So there are claims also that there have been some hits to Vasilivka Bridge further to the south as well. You got Vasilivka here, so possibly this bridge somewhere around here, that might also have been hit. We'll come onto that in a wee while, but I just want to go back to Rebar's map here. David D, very much a cheerleader for Ukraine, said, as I was right again, looks like the Russian brigade has been cut off. Claim here is that from Rebar's point of view, the Ukrainians have come down just north of Stepnohirsk, hit the reservoir and cut off some Russians in that area. So that is to say that the Ukrainians have, let's put this on the map with some arrows and whatnot. The Russians, the claim is, are kind of, or were all sort of in that kind of area there, and the Ukrainians have now sort of come into this section here, and that has cut off the Russians, who then are cut off up in here. If that's true, then that's good news. Cutting off the Russians is going to force the Russians to maybe panic a little bit, try and send in reserves, and Ukraine has the momentum, the initiative, and we have to wait and see what happens there. Also claims that the Ukrainians are, Ukrainians are where you would expect them to be by Andrew Perpetua's map, down just around Stepova. This is grey zone. In fact, that is exactly what is denoted here by the kind of hatched area, contested just above Stepova, right? So there you go. That is the difference between the mappers. We have some more claims from Russian propagandists. They're complaining, says Wall Translated, about a Ukrainian offensive near Stepnohirsk. The armed forces of Ukraine have begun gradually pushing the Russians back and have started lamenting the difficulties. So that's one we've just read there, but there's another one just down here we're going to read as well. The shallow Kakhovka reservoir is not helping much despite the 20-kilometer stretch, as the Russian channel notes that airstrikes in the area have increased. So in the event of success, the following areas will be under threat: Steppe, Small Shabak, and Kamenskoye. So I think basically that's going to be, I assume, Kamyanska, which is here, and Mali Shabaki. That's probably what Small Shabak is. I'm not 100% sure. The front line from where the local advance towards Zaporizhia previously began, the worst, albeit unlikely scenario, is a breakthrough to Vasilivka. In this case, the infiltration will be mirror, and the opponent will find himself in a vulnerable position. And the Ukrainians do have to be careful, but if you remember back during the May 2023 counteroffensive, the Ukrainians decided to attack down to Robotyne, right? So they had a couple of choices. They had three choices, if I remember correctly, and this is just, I'm spitballing here, going off what I remember, but the Ukrainians attacked down into Robotyne, and this was the main area of their attack. It was pretty silly because all of the Russian fortifications, it was the strongest concentration of Russian fortifications. Another one was talking about going down to Polohi, that kind of area, and then another one was coming down here to Vasilivka, which is quite an important staging point, this area over here, and where a bridge has potentially just been struck. So what this source is just saying is that actually what the Ukrainians might do, well, what's probably going to happen is that they're just going to get back to where the original front line was, previously. Okay. And that's down to sort of Kamyanska, equalizes it across here as it was. So the Russians lose all this area up there. But worst case scenario for the Russians, then they get all the way down to here. I think that's highly unlikely, but the Russians are worrying about that. So Kamyanska, this river here, was where the front line was. This was a natural barrier. The Ukrainians were in control of Kamyanska to the north, while the Russians were in control of Kamyanska to the south of the river. But that has since changed, and the Ukrainians have been put under increasing pressure as the Russians have been moving closer and closer to Zaporizhia. It's one of the major cities of Ukraine, and they really need to keep the Russians away from there. Absolutely vital they keep the Russians away from there, and so that includes artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, and indeed drones. They don't want drones to have a longer and longer range. You can get obviously Molnias and things into Zaporizhia, but they don't want to get small FPV drones frequenting Zaporizhia. It makes it pretty hellish for the Ukrainians there. And in fact, there are complaints already coming every day that Zaporizhia is becoming more and more hellish. I mean, I was there back in 2024, and you would have thought, it wasn't particularly risky at all to go there, but nowadays you'd think twice. Earlier, we already wrote about the threat of a counteroffensive by the armed forces of Ukraine, says the same source, with the aim of pushing back the Russian armed forces from the front line on the Konka River. So the Konka River is this one, I think, up here, or unless it is, I think it's the one that comes through Primorska, to be honest, but it might be the one that comes through Kamyanska. I think it's a Primorska area. Anyway, and the approaches to Zaporizhia. And in fact, we can state, if not the beginning of it, then a very large-scale reconnaissance in force, and how many forces the enemy has amassed in the liberated villages is a question that will almost certainly remain unanswered. So they are panicking to some degree, the Russians, and that's good news in my books. Now, no reports is reporting the same. Russian source Rebar says Ukrainian forces began the offensive near Stepnohirsk on the front, that is 20 kilometers wide, in the Zaporizhia direction. It reports that Lukyanivska is under Ukrainian control. Ongoing battles in Novoikolivka and Russian units in Primorska cut off after advances towards Plavny. Okay, so exactly what Rebar was saying there, just sort of repeating that. That's your situation there. We heard the other day that Lukyanivska was liberated by the Ukrainians, so that has happened a few days back, by all accounts. Now, MK Mapping talked about this a few days back. This is where he had the Ukrainians claiming that they liberated 38.2 square kilometers. Of course, Andriy Perpetua has none of this under Russian control anyway, so there's a zero gain from the Ukrainians, and that's why you're getting lots of people being wildly optimistic about what Ukraine is achieving at the moment, saying that they have. And indeed, I think there's been some mainstream media reporting today, I can't remember which newspaper it was, saying Ukraine has taken back more land than it has at any point since. In fact, no, it's taken back more land than it did in the 2023 counteroffensive, which famously didn't get very far, right? Talk about that Robotyne area and maybe a little bit up in Bakhmut, but they've taken more land back now. But of course, that's really, I think, only correct if you count all of that land being under Russian control previously, and that's what is contested by many mappers. So here, MK Mapping again, more recently, just yesterday, says in this area, the Ukrainian forces continue their counterattacks and have made a new progress in the direction of Stepnohirsk after clearing large parts of the field southwest of Stalinivka, Ukrainian forces push further southwest to the next tree lines, capturing new positions on the tactical heights there. From here, they pushed even further, entrenching along the Stepnohirsk to Lukyanivska road, while some assault groups managed to infiltrate into the northern streets of Stepnohirsk. So a further 4.6 square kilometers liberated in favor of Ukraine, as according to AMK. More recently, not done a mapping update today on it though. And then with us here says the Russian reports that a Ukrainian airstrike hit the Vasilivka bridge. An interesting strike there. It is, yeah. This is going to be a major supply route for the Russians, and I think that is going to hurt the Russian ability to supply their defenses here. They're going to be pretty. They were always under a lot of pressure here anyway when they were moving north. I remember doing some mapping updates saying, look, the Russians are moving slowly north of this river at Kamyanska, but there is quite a lot of successful Ukrainian drone activity. They had pretty good drone coverage around here, and they were making the Russians hurt for every square kilometer they were taking. And I assume that's continued being the case. And now the Ukrainians have enough to push back in this area. The Russians are unable to hold on. It's just how far the Ukrainians push the Russians now, and whether they just try and just get the line back to what it was and reinforce these areas more robustly, or whether they have designs to push further on. And Vasilivka would be great if the Ukraine could take that, but I find that fairly unrealistic, given that Ukraine just simply doesn't have the resources, especially when they are committing to over here quite a bit, but they're also defending Pokrovsk. They're attacking. There's been some counterattacks in Konstantinivka for the Ukrainians, counterattacks in Chasiv, counterattacks in Liman, counterattacks in the Borova area, counterattacks in the Kupiansk area. So, you know, the Ukrainians, they're very stretched. They, you know, they have chosen to push back in a lot of places, I presume, hoping that the Russians are pretty exhausted, and they appear to be. It's also worth reminding you, as a, you know, I went through this morning in the hits and losses video, worth reminding you that one of the theories is that Ukraine is actually regaining the initiative ahead of a Russian offensive in spring, and that everything they're doing at the moment is to basically mess up the offensive. It's not so much to take back land, although that's obviously going to be part of their objectives, and it is going to be, you know, as a form of defense here, to make sure that they've got the Russians pushed further away from Zaporizhia, further away from Petrovsk, Dnipro city, but also it's to mess up the Russian attack that appears to have been planned for spring. And if the Ukrainians are making the Russians commit forces that they were getting ready to attack, the Ukrainians are making the Russians react to what the Ukrainians are doing, then the Russians aren't able to plan to do what they were going to do. So this is a very well-timed set of attacks. And of course, it fits in line with Starlink going down and Telegram being shut off and all these other social media platforms being shut off. So, you know, the Russians are not helping themselves. Elon Musk has not helped them, which is great to hear. And the Ukrainians have, I think, planned this for some time. They've amassed some troops and they're attacking in quite a lot of places. It's just how far they are willing to take these attacks. I'm sure we'll see. Right, that's enough for me. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.